Welcome to the Turnaround Podcast with your host, Stephen Phillips. In each episode, Stephen speaks to experienced practitioners who discuss their careers, key moments, challenges, and lessons learned in financial turnarounds and business restructuring. Join us as we unravel the secrets to turning struggling businesses into success stories. You can find this show on all the major platforms, including YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and on our website, frilibertas.com. Now, here's the host of the Turnaround Podcast, Stephen Phillips.
Hello, and welcome to the Turnaround Podcast. Having ventured to Ukraine in our last podcast, we return to London this week. I'm delighted to welcome Richard Heis, who is a doyen of the restructuring and insolvency scene, and he's been there for the last 30-odd years. He has spent most of his career at KPMG before leaving the partnership in 2017, and shortly after taking up the role of CRO of Steinhoff Group. Following that, he took the opportunity to rejoin his former KPMG teammates as part of Interpath. He is mainly known in the market for banking insolvencies, going back to Barings Bank, and more recently, well-known insolvencies such as Dunfermline Building Society and MF Global. Richard, thank you so much for joining the Turnaround Podcast.
Delighted to be here, Stephen.
Well, I'm going to start with the question that I raise with everyone on this show, which is how you got started. I mean, I think it's fair to say that no one comes to see their parents at a very young age and say, I want to be an insolvency practitioner. So how did you get into the profession?
I think I probably got into it the same way as most people, Stephen, which is entirely by accident. I was, a pretty undistinguished KPMG FS auditor, probably wondering where I was going to go with life. Went to Hong Kong for a couple of years. Not sure that really provided the answer. And then by pure accident, I ran into Mike Wheeler, who said, we're short of somebody who, is a sort of all-round generalist. And I was thrown into a rights issue of a sales promotion company. That gradually became a rescue rights issue because the earnouts were being manipulated somewhat. So the profitability of the companies seemed to be rather higher than one would have thought, which created enormous cash demands, followed by insolvency, followed by me receiving my own personal legal advice at a tender age of not very much. And following that, becoming director and president of lots of insolvent US companies and selling the assets generally back to the people who had sold them in the first place. And I have to say, I was hooked.
Did you start out in audit then?
Yeah, I mean, in those days, most people did. Yeah.
So I suppose the point being that you go from audit, which is just to look at other people's books and take a view on them, to, I guess, a pretty strong, important role as you sit there and trying to work out a business. That must have appealed.
Exactly. It was, especially because I did very big banks, so I was always a pretty junior member of the team and never really understood what was going on. And in Hong Kong, my principal client was HSBC, where only the senior partner was allowed to know the inner reserves that the bank held. So it always felt a little bit unrewarding to be so far from the action. And then, exactly as you say, suddenly you're front of stage.
And I guess my question is, well, first of all, would you advise this as an interesting profession to a young person starting out now? And if presumably the answer is yes, would you give advice as to how you would get into restructuring and IP work?
Yeah. Well, the first question, I think it is interesting. It's certainly interesting. Probably in some ways too interesting, depending on your personality type. So I certainly think that you need to be comfortable with imperfect information. You need to be able to make decisions, notwithstanding, you don't know all the facts and it might go wrong and so on. And you need to kind of think, well, if I don't make a decision, that's a decision. You've got to do something. And if you are uncomfortable with that, it's probably not the right place for you. I mean, I do remember on MF Global, we had a lot of lawyers, we had a lot of FS specialists, both in law and practice. And after 2 or 3 days, you would see some people going around and I would say, well, yeah, he hasn't slept, or, she is just worrying herself to death. And some other people would just absolutely grab it with both hands. And, nothing wrong with being somebody who can make decisions based on full analysis, and no doubt make far better decisions than I would. But alternatively, you might not be the right person for that role if you're never going to get that full picture.
Yeah. I mean, I guess that's one of the really difficult things. I can imagine you go into a situation often, particularly with banks, where things can fall apart very quickly, and then you have to make some absolutely massive decisions, like, well, shall I sell this portfolio right now, or should we hold on to it, or shall I keep X, Y, and Z on the trading desk, etc. It must be absolutely. I mean, the pressure on you in the early days must be enormous. Is that right? And how do you cope with it?
Well, I think it is a very highly charged situation for everybody involved, and not least the directors and the employees. So, I mean, clearly you can't demonstrate open signs of panic and so on, because people are depending on you to make sense of the situation. But I think there are two ways, and this isn't just financial services, of dealing with these things. One is to sort of kick the CEO out of his office and sit in his chair and say, right, meet the new boss, which is not my way. The other is to kind of effectively run the business through the line as far as you can, using the existing authority structures, and basically try and, you may not be having the same marketing kind of operation, and a lot of those people may not be valuable for a period going forward, but you probably still need them in the short term. And if you can build a kind of series of work streams and have people from the insolvency practitioners team, plus somebody from the legal team, the external lawyers, plus somebody from the company, and then you just use that as a way of breaking down the issues. Because if you try and face up to all of them individually with a kind of single point of entry, you will be overwhelmed. But and it also means that people feel their expertise and their commitment to their clients, to the job, etc., is being respected.
Well, I realized that we didn't finish off the first question, which is how would a young person get into this? It does sound exciting.
Well, I said how I got into it, which by accident, and probably a lot of people are similar, Stephen. But if you want to be a little bit more planned about the whole thing, I guess, joining a firm like us or one of the other boutiques, or alternatively via a PwC or whoever. But I mean, now there's a lot of other ways in. I mean, obviously your route is through the legal route. There are various investment banks and so on who specialize in restructuring. So there are a number of points of entry, but I guess I know most about the one I took, and the accountancy route seems to work pretty well, especially if you're insolvency license.
Yes, and I guess it's a pretty good route to go into other things. I presume that you've seen a lot of colleagues who've sort of gone into the the insolvency practices and then gone and worked in a hedge fund or in a bank. I presume that's a well-trodden route.
Yeah, it is. I mean, it's an interesting point you raise. I mean, one of the career path avenues seems to be running large accountancy firms. Possibly because of the commercial nature of the day-to-day job. So, for example, PwC have had a number of individuals who've got the sort of insolvency stripes. Look at people like THM, who are a group of insolvency practitioners who stopped taking appointments and then became senior executives within live businesses. I think there is some benefit in that kind of absolutely hard-nosed commercial experience where you can't take cash for granted. You've got to sort of fight to get the supply chain sorted out. I mean, there are some kind of crossover skills and experience points.
Yeah, I mean, it feels like business in the school of hard knocks, and if you're constantly doing that, you're getting quite a good skill set.
I think that's probably right. I mean, certainly the ability to focus and not be distracted is quite useful. If you get it wrong, the whole thing's going to fall apart, which obviously may not be as useful in a kind of steady state business. But it's quite useful in a crisis situation.
Yes, and over time, I mean, we'll get into some individual cases actually, which might illustrate it. But I'd love to know your general sort of view of how things have changed in the 30 odd years that you've been doing this.
I kind of, I would say there's a lot of things. I mean, most things have changed, but just to pick out a handful, I guess the first would be the sort of ethics of the profession. And one of the drivers behind that was that when I started, I was the senior manager of the receiverships department. So, we weren't officers of the court. There was a certain amount of buccaneering and so on. And I think when I started, I think it was actually during the job in the US. We're trying to sell things. We really didn't have any credible buyers. We had to do it incredibly quickly with a people business. And when we were negotiating at 3:00 in the morning or whatever, we would arrange for ourselves to be called out by people around in the law firm's offices to take calls. And obviously, what we did was hang around for 5 minutes and then go back into the room because there was no caller. And you couldn't do that now because you're an officer of the court. You've got to act in good faith, and you have standards expected of you which don't involve misleading people deliberately and so on. So you couldn't do that, and there's probably a number of other examples you could point to. I guess in a different area entirely, there's things like banking, and we're involved in for example Northern Rock, and I think we all remember those images of people watching around the block and patiently queuing for their bank to open, and it was a run on the bank, and there hadn't been a run on the bank for 150 years in the UK. And this was all very unfamiliar. There was no resolution regime, and eventually, obviously, it got resolved with the help of the government's balance sheets, etc. Compare that to where we are now. Well, we have a resolution regime. It's an incredibly complex and involved one. It does mean that there is a way of protecting these situations and protecting users of the banking system without recourse to the government guarantee, and we're all aware of moral hazard now and too big to fail, etc. But it does mean that you have to deal with the current age of technology. and that means you can spread news about a situation within minutes, rather than waiting for Robert Peston to appear on the BBC, for example, in the Northern Rock days. And it means that you can take your money out within minutes or seconds, and that does mean that what used to unfold over days now unfolds over minutes and hours, as was seen with Silicon Valley Bank.
Yes. Well, it seems that what you could say is that things have speeded up. I mean, people can just use their app very, very quickly to transfer money, as opposed to, as you say, having to stand in a queue in the Northern Rock situation. But at the same time, I suppose what you could say is you've also got a lot more sophisticated tools and actually experience. So you probably are a bit more aware of what you need to do, and you can execute quicker, I presume.
Yeah, I think that is true. Well, I mean, clearly the owner of the resolution process in the UK is the Bank of England, who have obviously had an extremely good run with the banking crises that we've seen recently, with Silicon Valley Bank or Credit Suisse or a couple of other names, which have been resolved very effectively without recourse to the taxpayer, and without compromising the principles of resolution, in particular bail-in, where obviously in a number of countries a bail-in has been affected, but not necessarily in accordance with the intended principles.
Yeah. And I think you had a bit of a role in Silicon Valley Bank, which I think, as you said, was purchased by HSBC in some ways in the normal manner, maybe not necessarily for a great deal of money, but maybe you can talk a little bit about what you did there.
Yeah, I mean, well, we did very little other than prepare for the role as bank liquidator under the bank insolvency procedure, which obviously is a liquidation rather than a resolution. But the Bank of England, I mean, extraordinarily quickly managed to secure a buyer in the form of HSBC. HSBC were a very appropriate buyer because clearly the size of HSBC is in itself something that calmed the markets, and the liquidity challenges. Obviously, you'd need a bank of a very substantial size to be able to meet the liquidity challenges. So, and that was done by way of a resolution by a share transfer order by the Bank of England. So we actually were on entirely different paths, and we would have been our kind of relatively brief role, if it had been the different path, would obviously have been a very substantial role as bank liquidator. But the bank was clearly very well capitalized, and the only thing that would have prevented it would be the absence of somebody of the size and power of HSBC.
So essentially, you would a plan B in case that deal or a similar deal didn't take place.
Exactly.
And I think I'm sure people watching this, I'm sure many of the audience will have been in the room in a situation where outside the room there's a Richard Heis waiting to fulfill that kind of role, whether it's in a bank resolution or just in a ordinary sort of administration. And that's what plan B, and the possibility of plan B is obviously the thing that concentrates the mind of plan A. So even though you've been modest, you didn't do very much, it probably helped concentrate the mind a bit.
Well, I think the situation certainly concentrated the mind, Stephen. And as you say, if you've got plan A, which is to find a way of saving the business and continuing broadly as normal, possibly on the back of a sale, and helping to plan for a liquidation, you clearly have a natural priority in favor of the former.
Yeah.
But most people in these situations are very decent, work incredibly hard to try and get the best out of a crisis that they probably had no idea about, a few days or whatever before.
So I wanted to go back to one of the most sort of famous banking crises, perhaps that there's been in my lifetime, which is Barings. I know you had quite an interesting involvement on this, and I think one of the stories perhaps that this may bring out is what I might call the sort of Americanization of the market, or the sort of the introduction of hedge funds, etc. And I think that might be an interesting case study, just to sort of for you to explain what happened there.
Yeah, well, it is interesting, Stephen. It does require me to think back a little bit, but I think some of the memories are reasonably scarred onto my brain. It was a process where, following the collapse of Barings, and obviously everybody knows what happened with Nick Leeson and so on. But following that, I think there was a very careful process put together by the UK authorities to try and do things in a relatively consensual, civilized way. And I think it was Lord Templeman or somebody who was responsible for leading that process. I think it took a couple of years, and the auditors all sort of tipped some money in, and ING did something, and the banks who owned the Barings debt were involved, and it was all kind of I think quite a genteel process, and then enter the note holders who came in and bought one of the major tranches of the debt, and basically blew the whole thing up. And I don't think people were used to that kind of thing. I was not used to it. Their lawyer was actually one of your former alumni from the podcast, Andrew
Yes.
Wilson. And it was, it was extraordinary. It was exciting. It was dramatic. It was a super complicated situation. But I think the main thing I remember from those days, and that I learned, was the power of making your problem somebody else's problem. And the illustration of that was that the note holders said, we need, and we don't care how you achieve it, we need $88.888 million. And it's got to be that number. And everybody knew 88.888 was the number. You've got to get that. Was there any logic to that? Absolutely not. Where did it come from? It came from the fact that Nick Leeson's error account was called error account 88888. So everybody knew it was ridiculous. But their conviction that the only way to solve this is if you get us our number, and effectively it worked. In order to kind of get them over the line, maybe you had to sort of push a few soft numbers in there and so on. But in the end, we got them there, 88.888. And at that stage, everything got resolved. But I thought it was a lesson that, was a very useful lesson, and very far away from the experience I'd had previously.
Yeah, I was working in Singapore immediately after this disaster had unfolded, and it was still very raw in a sort of interesting way that you sort of got reminders of it quite often. For example, I used to play rugby at the Singapore Cricket Club, and one of my favorite things is to walk past the entrance, and they basically say the following people are not welcome in this club, and the first name was Nicholas William Leeson.
So I thought you were going to say it was yours, Stephen.
No, that was later. We'll talk about that. But yeah, no, it was, and I also had the opportunity to star in the at least be an extra in the film that they made of it out
Really?
there. But I think that you had an interesting. We were chatting before, and your interesting bit of memorabilia that you sold. Tell the audience about that.
Yeah. It was. I mean, it was way after all of the the main action had been done, and then one day we were told that a series of crates had been located in Singapore, and in one of them was all of the team's trading jackets, including Nick Leeson's, which was quite distinctive because he had his wife, at the time, his wife's initials sewn in it, Lisa Leeson. So we kind of, it's quite hard to sell moldy old, 8-year-old trading jackets. But obviously Leeson's own one was distinctive. So I did call up, sorry, I didn't mention this to you, Stephen, but I called up Christie's and said, look, can we sell this? It is something of significance. And they said, well, our clothing department, they deal in, one, historic clothes, and it's not old enough to be historic, and two, stuff that, the fashionistas like Madonna's conical bra or whatever. But it doesn't really fit Nick Leeson's trading jacket. So we didn't get anywhere there, and we came to the view that the only way we could really get good money for it is by creating a story. So in the end, the Daily Mail was the most enthusiastic buyer of the story. So we had lots of photos in the Daily Mail. I was encouraged to wear it myself, which I unbecoming an officer of the court, so somebody else did. And yeah, we got 30 grand for it, which wasn't bad. Made the exercise worth doing.
Yeah, I suppose it feels to me like this is another reason why it's quite fun to do the job that you're doing, because there's a certain showmanship element to doing something like that and making a market and creating some interest around something ostensibly perhaps there wouldn't be.
Yeah, well, it was certainly fun. I think if I was interested in showmanship, Stephen, I would have worn the jacket, but
yeah, I suppose what this reminds me, or what this sort of makes me realize, is that there's often quite a lot of high emotion, huge amount of stress when you're first going in. Have you dealt with that well in your career? Do you think you're getting better at it, or you're calming down? How's it work for you?
I think it's fine. I mean, I think if you go into a situation like that and none of the emotion and so on around the place means anything to you, I think you're probably, you've been doing it too long. I mean, I think you should always have, a feeling of trepidation, obviously be charged up with a lot of energy in order to tackle the challenge. But yeah, I mean, you obviously need a certain amount of emotional detachment to avoid just sort of, I don't know, emotionally responding, when obviously what you need to do is respond analytically and commercially. So probably one of the questions when I'm not talking to you, I get asked by friends and so on is, well, how do you deal with it? How do you deal with redundancies, etc.? And I think it's always uncomfortable, but on the other hand, you're not doing it because it's vindictive. You're not doing it, recklessly or without care. You want to do it in the right way. But I think the main thing is to be honest with people. One of my early jobs, it was during the Asian crisis. It was a polyester factory in Northern Ireland. I went over, it was before the Good Friday Agreement. There were separate doors for the Catholics and the Protestants. And, it was a close down. And I had to stand up on stage as a dulcet tones of a sort of English guy, explain that the factory was closing and everyone was losing their jobs. And it was very uncomfortable. What happened? Nothing. people accepted it. People, were reasonable. They asked some questions. And, the fact is most people, if they're treated honestly, are decent. Occasionally you get the odd bad one. I'd say probably I've had far more examples of that in the around the board than I have amongst the workforce.
Yes. Is there a particular fraught moment that really jumps out to you? You remember and think, "Oh God, that was horrible."
Well, probably some, but I mean, in those early days, I mean, before my auditing banking skills actually became relevant again, I did a lot of sort of more more kind of meat and drink type stuff. Sorry, excuse me. I did a lot more meat and drink type stuff. And, I did a crawler crane factory. And we had, as one does, trying to sell the business, we're trading it on, got the workforce together and said, look, the sale process, we're all pulling together as a team and thank you for your efforts and giving them updates. But unbeknownst to me, one of the employees was actually on secondment from a major supplier and rang and said, "Look, the goods yard's going to be empty because we're all going in for this chat at 3:00." And then somebody spotted that there was a big truck come into the goods yard to take away all of their stuff. That obviously their ROT was either not very good or they didn't trust their ability to get it back the legal route. So we I immediately gave the order because we had crawler cranes. They were mobile and very big, and said we just need to block the exit. So we had the bizarre standoff of them having a truck full of all of our stuff. And us saying give it back, and them saying you can't do this, you're imprisoning me, move your cranes. And that is fraught. It's, I mean, people in our profession, as you know, Stephen, I mean, there has been a bit of violence. I did feel our workforce was absolutely on our side, with one exception, the mole. And there were more of us, and I think people were really bought into the fact that we're trading here, we're trying to save the business, and if somebody comes along and nicks key components, that's going to ruin the mission for everybody. So, we 99% of a crawler crane is worth zero. A completed crawler crane is worth quite a lot. So, as one does, you kind of agreed, well, okay, you can have that, but you can't have that. And, in the end, we parted amicably.
I think it's probably worth, for those people in the audience who don't understand what ROT means, it just means retention of title clauses, so that when people sell, often they try and retain some ownership, so that in this particular kind of scenario, they might be able to make a claim and say, actually, I want that widget back, etc. So this is a sort of well-trodden conflict between administrator and supplier. So interesting that it almost came to blows. It probably wasn't the first and wasn't the last. I wanted to move on because I think your role in Steinhoff, the furniture group, which had an element of fraud, was a fascinating one. So you came out of KPMG a few years ago, didn't you? And then pretty much you went sort of straight into this sort of chief restructuring officer role.
I had done a few things in between, but it came pretty quickly. Obviously, it came out of the blue for everybody. The problem was discovered in early December 2017, and I took the role in early February 2018, I think. And it was the Steinhoff was a blue chip company in South Africa. It had a massive market capitalization. And there were accounting irregularities which were found in the way that they had prepared their accounts over many years. So it was a fascinating role. I think one of my qualifications for the job was that there's only one of me, and I think the directors of Steinhoff, didn't want to be swarmed in a situation where people are still reeling from the shock. But we had, the advisors had very substantial resources in the form of Linklaters and Molis, and clearly I had no organization, I had no team, and the debt was 11 billion euros, and there were 4 different restructurings, vast amounts of intercompany, which to some extent was a feature of the accounting irregularities. So, and how do you do a restructuring when the intercompany debt, nobody really is able to gauge whether it's real or not. Well, it was a big bite. But and without having a team, it was difficult. But we effectively crafted one, and Rob Lewis and James Lewin of PwC were effectively seconded to Steinhoff to help. And we became very good friends over that period and have remained so. And we co-opted various people from Steinhoff itself to join our makeshift team. And one way or another, it got done. It was a lot of work, but it was an enormously interesting experience. I mean, very full on.
It's interesting. I think the not being part of some mega organization often that can be quite a good thing in itself. There aren't the conflicts that you're just being asked to do a very specific task. You don't come with the baggage of needing to sort of generate millions of dollars of revenue, as some of the CROs are in big organizations that have revenue targets, etc.
Yeah.
So an interesting model. In some ways, I must a bit of a self plug. That's kind of slightly, one of the things that I try and do, which is just to say, look, we don't have conflicts. We're not trying to sort of take lots of clients. It's we're just doing a very specific job. So an interesting model that you actually came out of that. And there's another pun that I'm going to come up, which is tell us about the path to Interpath, and excuse the pun.
Well, the path to Interpath, again, wasn't a very long one. When I stopped the CRO role when the restructuring took place, but the lawyers had managed to manufacture lots of incredibly complicated companies for the purposes of the restructuring, in particular to deal with the many kind of tax issues that came when obviously when you change the accounts, you change the tax, and it was all fiendishly involved. So I carried on in the capacity as a director of certain companies for I think about 8 months afterwards. But then it was COVID, looking around for the next thing to do, and one way or another, and again, like Steinhoff, I was lucky with the timing. I became aware that KPMG was considering, and it was all a little hush-hush, so it's like hints and whispers. I wasn't sure that I could necessarily rely on it, but the suggestion was that I rejoin, the business that I had left in anticipation of a sale. So I was very interested in the sale, never go back. I didn't really want to sort of just rejoin KPMG, notwithstanding that KPMG, flows through my veins, to having spent so long there. So I chose not to be a partner, so I could sort of go and do something else much more easily if it hadn't been sold. But it was sold, private equity deal, which is fascinating. No conflicts, all my old pals, and the benefits of being part of something that's just sort of growing, expanding geographically. We've just started in Bermuda, France, in terms of lots of disciplines. And thankfully, the one discipline that's missing is auditing, which was the source of all the pain in the first place. So, I mean, it's great.
Because I think this spin-off technique is something we've seen with some of the other big four. Do you think these big organizations now regret spinning off, and do you think they're going to, set up their own, or do you think this was done for a very regulatory, specific regulatory purpose, and they're not going to go back into consulting and restructuring?
It's a big question. It's a big series of questions, Stephen. I mean, what's the driver for doing it? Well, you are the conflicts regime is not going to get easier, and it has become more and more difficult. And the bigger you are, the more likely you are to have a conflict. And one reason for spinning off is to monetize it. Obviously KPMG made quite a bit of money when they sold us. And I guess the issue is, if you're part of a full service firm, you have the benefits at KPMG. There'll be somebody there who knows about anything, no matter how obscure, and you've got all of those specialists absolutely on tap. But on the other hand, it takes you, several days to work out whether you can take a job or not. And given that we obviously know people in the market, we're still, as I say, KPMG blood is running through my veins. I know a lot of people, so does everybody here. And we also know people at other firms. And if we need something, we can get it really quickly. So I think that works, that tends to work very well.
Well, let's move on to the current state of the restructuring insolvency market and what you're seeing, because it felt like certainly in the UK economy in the first sort of 6 to 9 months, things were sort of felt quite hopeful. I remember I had a discussion with Bill Blaine, who's an economist, earlier in the year, and I was bullish. He was less bullish. I felt like, events favored my view. And then suddenly we've lost a bit of momentum, perhaps with, the election, etc. Where do you think we are in the UK and in the wider global market?
Well, I think probably as a global point, but certainly as a UK point, COVID had a major impact. And I think everybody was thinking, oh my goodness, COVID is going to cause widespread insolvencies because it's obviously changing people's business models massively. But, for that reason, a lot of support was put in place in a number of industries, hospitality industries, the arts, tourism, etc., all the things that were hit very hard. And, all of that, there's been a lot of money in the private sector over a long period, and the funds are very well resourced. And then the government, through quantitative easing, etc., created a vast amount of public money, and some extent, that resulted in very, very few insolvencies. But now, nothing kind of can stay up and defy gravity forever. And now we're in an era of gradual quantitative tightening. It does seem that there are a number of, the usual suspects of casual dining, retail, have always been industries that have led to quite a lot of restructuring and problems. I mean, probably not as many as people would think, but if you look at the stats, it is quite clear that month on month, there is a gradual increase in the number of insolvencies. There's quite a lot happening on the restructuring side as well, which you would know very well, Stephen, the, liability management and other techniques being used to, restore the balance sheets and maturities of indebted companies. There's a lot of pre-packs. There have been a lot of generally effectively pre-packs to change the ownership or change the capital structure. Quite a lot of restructurings by restructuring plans, although clearly a lot of those are being challenged, not like the days of schemes when they hardly ever were, for reasons we we could go into if we had more time. And I think one of the other very significant things is the rise of the credit funds, which I think is very welcome. They're very flexible, quite innovative, not to decry the banks in any way, but, it is clearly a major move in terms of capital provision in distressed situations, that the credit funds are very, very large and growing.
And are you seeing, this is perhaps the last question, but it's something I think I've been seeing a bit more and getting a bit more involved in, litigation funding as a IP. Is that something that you've sort of resorted to on occasion, where you sort of think, well, there's a juicy claim here, but, it costs a lot of money, it takes a lot of time. Can I find a way of monetizing that without, capital outlay?
Absolutely, yes. It's not something that I traditionally have been involved with, but these days, it's a very, it's a very kind of interesting, esoteric world. And I'm certainly not the expert on it, Stephen, but I have colleagues who absolutely are. And people know each other, and they know the AT providers and all of the technical bells and whistles required to turn something into a fully funded claim. It's a fascinating world. It obviously makes a lot of sense. The amounts involved are pretty eye-watering in terms of the returns. But on the other hand, they're providing a very important service at high risk.
Yes. Yeah. Well, Richard, I think our time's drawn to a close. I think it's been really interesting to talk to somebody who's had such a wide span of interesting cases. And so I really appreciate you giving the time. And, once again, thank you.
Yeah, well, always nice spending time with you, Stephen, in any format. And I've enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
You've been tuning in to the Turnaround podcast with your host, Stephen Phillips. You can find this show on all the major platforms, including YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and on our website, freilibertas.com. Thank you for your positive reviews, comments, questions, and for sharing this show with others.